In the closing months of 1944, the Eastern Front no longer appeared on maps as a neat succession of lines, but as a blurred expanse covered by arrows and shaded areas. Winter had arrived early, pressing down over fertile fields, roads, market towns, and railway lines with the same brownish-grey tone, as if an invisible hand had been rubbing the paper again and again with deliberate force. Soviet forces advanced continuously from the east and northeast, tearing open the German defensive line time after time and forcing it to be hastily stitched back together. Supplies to the rear grew ever more scarce, and the rations promised on paper for soldiers at the front were increasingly transformed, in reality, into half-baked black bread, watery soup, and intermittent tins of preserved food. The British blockade and bombing of transport routes had already left the German food supply as a whole stretched to the breaking point. After requisitions and priority shipments to cities in the homeland, whatever food could be sent to the front was limited from the outset, and the harsh climate of the Eastern Front and its long supply lines further compressed this tiny margin. Hanna Krüger first learned to look for something to eat in rubbish heaps near a field storage depot in Belarus. She was just over 20 at the time, wearing a grey-green uniform cut a little too loose, with the insignia of auxiliary service on her shoulder straps. On paper, her position was female supply service assistant, but in practice, most of her work consisted of registering passing vehicles, handing out documents, and helping the kitchen staff count sacks of flour, dried vegetables, and tins of food. She came from a small-town family near Leipzig, and had been an apprentice in a textile mill before the war. After the war broke out, a local mobilization order had pulled her away from the looms and into the tents of a field supply station. For her, the hardest thing to adapt to was neither the cold nor the danger of battle, but that day-after-day feeling of hunger, of never knowing where the next meal would come from. Behind the depot there was a row of temporary refuse pits, filled with peeled-off potato skins, beet stalks frozen dark, the occasional piece of sliced-off sausage casing, and the ends of bread that had been bitten a few times and then discarded. In theory, all of this was supposed to be buried in a central site to prevent rats and disease. By the winter of 1944, however, no one really had the strength to enforce that rule. After dark, many people would pretend they were going to the latrine, then circle around to the pits. By the dim yellow beam of a flashlight, they would grab handfuls of scraps that had not yet completely frozen and stuff them into their pockets. At first, Hanna only watched from a distance, her heart filled with an unspeakable shame and hesitation. But after several days in a row, when the soup she received from the kitchen contained nothing more than a few floating leaves, that shame slowly turned into a more primitive impulse under the stabbing pain in her stomach. That night the snow was falling very fine, drifting through the air like powder. By the time she made her way to the refuse pit, someone had already beaten her to it. An infantryman recently pulled back from the front, ammunition pouches still hanging from his shoulders, was rummaging through the filthy heap with hands stiff from the cold. Oil and mud clung to his knuckles, and the warmth of his breath showed in the darkness like steam leaking from an old boiler. When he found half a piece of sausage skin that was still more or less intact, a complex and fleeting light flashed in his eyes. Not quite joy, not quite gratitude, but the short, guarded satisfaction of a beast that has just located food. In her later memories, Hanna returned again and again to that look. In that moment she understood that although she was only a few steps away from the heap, her mind had already begun to slide toward a different level. To stay alive, she would have to learn to snatch things that were meant to be buried, like an animal. The first time she reached into the rubbish heap, her fingers touched a lump of half-frozen potato peel. It was cold and wet, carrying the smell of burnt-out coal dust and earth. She slipped it into her pocket, then groped her way further in, searching for parts that had not yet been completely soaked through with dirty water. The instant her fingers brushed against a hard edge of bread crust, a brief surge of pleasure shot through her nerves, like a tiny fire being lit in the middle of a wasteland. She learned how to tell the difference between food and refuse in the dark by touch alone, learned how to avoid getting her uniform too filthy, learned how to pretend she was just passing by whenever she heard footsteps. During that period, she seldom looked people straight in the eye, because she knew there were secrets similar to her own hidden in their gaze. The course of the war, however, did not change because of such grey survival skills. In early 1945, as the Soviet winter offensive continued to push forward, many of the rear area depots on the Eastern Front were hastily relocated or simply abandoned. The supply unit to which Hanna belonged was ordered to withdraw westward, transported by rail and road towards Silesia and Bohemia. Along the way, she saw more and more horse carts crammed with refugees, destroyed bridges and mass graves dug in haste by the side of the fields. Many of the everyday details that had once given her a sense of security, such as roll calls at fixed times and the issuing and distribution of supplies according to forms, became blurred and chaotic during the retreat, and sometimes simply vanished altogether. She began to treat every meal she could get as if it might be the last, stuffing her small cloth bag with rock-hard biscuits that were almost impossible to bite, and broken pieces of black bread. In her mind, everything she knew about the Americans came from leaflets and radio broadcasts before and during the war. People there were portrayed as fat and lazy, fighting their battles with machines and tinned food, cruel to prisoners of war, treating captives like livestock, even deliberately starving them in revenge. These images had taken root so firmly in her mind that when older soldiers in the unit quietly remarked, "If you have to choose between surrendering to the Russians or to the Americans, you'd best choose the Americans," she at first assumed it was some kind of dry joke. What truly began to shake her convictions was another rumor she heard by chance during the retreat. According to it, prisoners transported to the Western Front had written home saying that in some camps they were given white bread to eat and were required to stay clean and undergo medical checkups. As this piece of news passed among soldiers who had long since grown used to refuse heaps and frozen broth, it was somehow taken as a strange form of consolation. Some laughed and shook their heads, some kept silent, and many simply shrugged and tightened their belts as usual. By the spring of 1945, Soviet forces had already crossed the Oder River, and on the Western Front, the Allied forces were massing west of the Rhine in preparation for river crossings. Hanna was temporarily reassigned to a supply depot near Leipzig, responsible for distributing the last batches of material to units about to be sent to the front. The bombing grew more frequent, and the city was shrouded by day in wailing air raid sirens and heavy smoke. Whenever the alarm sounded and crowds surged toward shelters and cellars, Hanna would instinctively touch the pieces of hard bread in her pocket, just to reassure herself that she still had a small measure of security she could control. One afternoon, under such conditions, the depot received orders to withdraw westward and to load up everything that could be taken away as quickly as possible, destroying or abandoning the rest. In the ensuing confusion, she joined a convoy heading southwest, but they encountered air raids and traffic jams on the way, and the unit was scattered. A few days later, when she and a handful of remaining personnel were surrounded by American armored vehicles at the edge of a field, she no longer knew whether this counted as a kind of release. The act of being captured contained nothing dramatic. In the distance stood a neat line of tanks and trucks. The steady, rhythmic roar of their engines completely different from the tense, strained noise she'd grown used to on the Eastern Front. The American soldiers' gestures were clear, instructing them to throw down their weapons, raise their hands, and walk to an assembly point that had been cleared by the roadside. As the column moved forward, she noticed several wooden crates on the tailgate of a nearby American truck, and from them protruded rows of neatly packaged tins and white loaves of bread stacked in order. For a moment, she almost thought she was seeing things. In her previous experience, bread and tins that could be laid out whole on a surface always belonged to higher command echelons or rear area cities far from the front, never to people standing in the mud with their hands in the air, being treated as the enemy. In the next few days, she was transported, as a prisoner of war, to a larger POW reception center. This facility was administered by American military police and administrative personnel, with registration tables, quarantine points, bathhouses, and temporary barracks set up in accordance with field regulations. American wartime technical manuals laid down each step of the process from capture to final accommodation, requiring that prisoners be removed from the front as quickly as possible, sent to relatively safe rear areas, and, where circumstances permitted, kept under basic standards of housing, hygiene, and diet. At the registration table, she gave the unsmiling sergeant the last pieces of personal information she had left: name, date of birth, and former unit designation. Her name was written on a card, and a number was stamped on a small metal tag that was then hung around her neck. After that, she was taken to strip and be disinfected, washing away the dirt and lice that long-distance marching had left on her clothes and hair. When the hot water shower first came on above her head, she could hardly believe this was a resource prepared for her. On the Eastern Front, hot water had long since become a distant memory. Most of the time, washing meant hastily rubbing her hands and face with icy river water or melted snow. Now the water ran down her shoulders and back, rinsing layers of fatigue clinging to her skin into the drains. On the wall of the bathhouse, she saw notices written in English and brief German: no relieving oneself on the floor, no washing clothes in the basins, keep the bathhouse clean. Those words gave her a strange sense of dislocation. She was a captive, yet was being asked to use public facilities as if she were a responsible person. Once she had been assigned to a barrack, she received 2 blankets, a simple but clean set of underwear, a metal mess tin, and a spoon. According to the manual, the food standards in POW camps were to be kept as close as possible to those of American rear area troops, at least in terms of caloric intake and nutritional balance as set out in Army regulations. This meant 3 scheduled meals a day, including a certain amount of bread, potatoes or other staples, a meat or bean dish, and coffee or some other hot drink. When she walked toward the dining hall for the first time, her steps were, by instinct, somewhat hesitant. The prisoners standing in line initially maintained the quiet, typical of soldiers, but when they saw what was being ladled out of the large cauldrons, a low murmur of astonishment ran through the crowd. The soup contained not only pieces of potato but also meat chunks that were clearly recognizable. The bread being handed out was not fully refined white bread, but its color was noticeably lighter than that of most of the black bread she had seen on the Eastern Front. When she held out her tin, the cook, following the set standard, gave her a full ladle of food and placed a slice of bread almost as thick as the width of her hand on top. Sitting down at one of the long tables, she found herself completely at a loss. Over the past hours, her stomach had grown accustomed to using pain as a reminder. Now, faced with a bowl of soup in which the ingredients were plainly visible, she felt an impulse to back away. She carefully scraped a small spoonful of the broth and brought it to her mouth. The taste of salt was obvious, along with a hint of pepper or some other sharp seasoning. Rather than delicious, what this taste brought her was a long-lost sense of completeness. Her tongue could distinguish multiple components, and her teeth could feel the resistance of real chewing instead of just catching the occasional leaf adrift in a thin liquid. She ate very slowly, partly out of fear that eating too fast would upset her stomach, and partly due to a subconscious urge to economize. She wanted to prolong this meal as much as possible, as if that would somehow lengthen the life of the food itself. Yet the habits she had learned in front of refuse heaps did not disappear after just a few relatively adequate meals. Once the rhythm of life in the camp gradually stabilized, she was assigned back to a familiar sort of work, helping in the kitchen and storerooms. The American authorities needed a large labor force to keep the POW camp running. Everything from moving supplies to washing dishes, repairing barracks, and cleaning the grounds could be done by prisoners. In many POW camps on American soil and overseas, German prisoners were widely used for agricultural, construction, and logistical labor, and, in accordance with the Geneva Convention, received certain remuneration. This pay often took the form of canteen vouchers or small sums of money, allowing them to buy extra food, tobacco, and daily necessities in the camp shop. Next to the kitchen where she was assigned, there was a small area fenced off with wire specifically for food scraps and refuse awaiting disposal. After each mealtime, she and several other prisoners would pour the collected leftovers into designated containers, which would then be taken away by assigned personnel for processing outside the camp or used, where permitted, as feed. Unlike the chaotic, filthy refuse pits she had seen on the Eastern Front, everything here seemed to follow a certain cool order. Barrels were numbered, lines marked out where they were to be placed, and the work party responsible for transporting them recorded the weight every day. Even so, when she saw the first barrels of leftover food being tipped out, a dizzy feeling rose in her chest that she could not suppress. Among those leftovers were pieces of bread discarded after only half of them had been eaten. Apples with only a few bites taken, mashed potatoes uneaten because of seasoning issues, and dishes that were practically intact, thrown into the containers simply because they had been left too long. She watched as these things were scraped from tables and plates into the tubs, the sound of iron ladles striking metal ringing in her ears. That sound overlapped with the rustling in her memory of nights spent searching through garbage on the Eastern Front, making her fingers unconsciously tighten around the wooden handle of her brush. In her mind, she knew that here, as long as she lined up on time, she could get enough to eat. But deep in her body, the instincts formed over time kept telling her that throwing such things away was a guilt that could not be ignored. The true turning point came on an afternoon when the weather was slightly warmer. That day she was sent to the back door of the kitchen to help move in newly delivered sacks of flour. Outside the door was a short service lane where supply trucks could pull up for a brief stop, and beside it stood 2 metal garbage cans used to temporarily hold camp waste that could not be reused. A truck had just finished unloading, and several American soldiers were resting on the tailgate, eating lunches they had received from the mess. As she pushed an empty handcart past them, she instinctively glanced at the food in their hands. It was a sandwich made of sliced white bread with meat and vegetables inside. To her, that combination belonged almost exclusively to memories of certain festive days before the war. She did her best not to let her gaze linger, for fear it would be taken to mean something else. Just as she turned to leave, one of the soldiers finished his sandwich and casually tossed the remaining half of the bread into the nearby garbage can. That half-piece was almost unstained, looking lonely simply because the fillings had been eaten. When it hit the bottom of the can, it made a soft, dull sound that was infinitely magnified in her awareness. A second later, without any conscious thought, her feet were already moving toward the can. Her mind flashed through countless scenes outside refused pits in the dead of night. If she moved quickly enough, she could snatch that piece before anyone else. If she shoved it inside her clothing, no one would notice that a prisoner had gained half a piece of bread. Her hand was already outstretched, her fingertips just brushing the cold metal rim of the can, when a voice stopped her. It was not a barked order, but a calm and firm reminder. The American military policeman guarding the back door was standing a few steps away, one hand resting on the rifle slung behind him, though his expression was not sharp. He glanced at the garbage can, then at her, his face showing no anger or mockery, but rather a kind of thoughtful hesitation. Hannah's body froze at once. Her mind raced, laying out every possible consequence, violating camp regulations, being officially reprimanded, losing her work-related rations, perhaps even being thrown in a punishment cell. Worse still, other prisoners might have seen what she was doing. She could not bear to imagine how they would see her. The woman who had honed quick hands at refuse pits on the Eastern Front, suddenly feeling a shame unlike anything before. Yet the expected scolding did not come. The MP simply raised his hand slightly to signal her to stop, then walked over to the kitchen doorway. He tapped twice lightly on the doorframe and exchanged a few words with the cook inside, his tone flat, with no hint of reproach. A few minutes later, he emerged from the kitchen holding something new. A whole loaf of bread, intact, freshly taken from a crate. It was whiter than most of the bread she had seen on the Eastern Front, its crust tinged with a light golden color, clearly baked from relatively ample grain. The MP walked up to her and held the bread out. The gesture was simple and direct, without any sense of ceremony. There was no condescension or self-satisfied charity in his eyes, only the matter-of-fact completion of a small, ordinary task. When someone displays an extreme, hunger-driven impulse, you give her a full ration rather than let her dive into a garbage can for scraps. Hannah's hand hung in midair, and for a long time she did not take the bread. It felt as if a lump of cold air was wedged in her throat, stopping both speech and swallowing. Realizing that her delayed reaction was almost discourteous, she forced her fingers to move and cautiously touched the edge of the loaf. The bread felt slightly rough, with fine cracks left from baking, yet it was warm, at least warmer than her hand. That warmth was like a line slowly seeping inward, passing through her from the outside in. All at once she realized that the half piece of bread in the garbage can she had tried to grab, and the whole loaf now in her hands belonged, in fact, to the same world. What really separated her situation was not the food itself, but the way she was allowed to approach it. On the Eastern Front, she could only struggle with other hungry people in the middle of the night for scraps that had already been trampled, bitten, and mixed with filth, treating such humiliation as the price that must be paid to live. Here, a guard had stopped her from rummaging in the refuse, and, with a single very quiet act, told her that she no longer needed to survive in that way. In that moment, she felt an almost vertiginous sense of contrast. Within a few seconds, her memories were torn open in multiple layers. Frozen fingers at the edge of refuse pits, the constant fear of being discovered in the dark, and the weight of the intact loaf in her hands. She even had a faintly absurd illusion that if she were to loosen her grip, the barracks around her, the barbed wire, the watchtowers, and the distant military vehicles would all vanish, leaving her standing alone on some empty plain, with the reeking rubbish heap of the past on one side and the quietly handed-over bread on the other. She had to make a choice, and what she was choosing was no longer whether to live, but in what way to live. When she returned to the barrack, she placed the loaf on her bunk and sat there for a long time. She did not eat it right away, nor did she rush to break it into fragments and hide them in her pockets as she had done before. Instead, she ran her fingertips lightly over the crust, feeling the slightly softer interior beneath the hard shell. She knew that the whole loaf was enough to feed her for several days. If she followed the extreme economy she had practiced on the Eastern Front, she could slice it into pieces so thin they were almost invisible and eat only a little each day, stretching this gift into a long-lasting sense of security. But she also sensed that if she continued to treat food in that way, she might never escape the shadow that refuse heaps had left on her. The next day she took the loaf to the dining hall and dipped it in the soup in her mess tin. To an outside observer, this behavior might have seemed ridiculous. She looked as if she were wasting an additional chance, since the camp already provided a uniform ration each day. But she was deliberately making herself eat this bread in a public space within the normal rhythm of a meal, rather than in a secluded corner, secretly gnawing at it. She wanted her body to grow accustomed to a new logic. Food was not a prize wrested through stealth and seizure, but a resource distributed within a set of rules, according to one's status as a human being. As time passed, she began to notice details in the camp that she had previously overlooked. The infirmary conducted regular checkups on the prisoners and arranged special rations for those who were severely malnourished or ill. Notices posted around the camp listed the day's staple and side dishes, sometimes explaining that certain ingredients could not be supplied temporarily because of transport problems. Work schedules for labor detachments showed daily hours and rest breaks and stated that forced overtime was not permitted. Behind these rules lay a complete prisoner-of-war management system that the wartime U.S. Army had built around TM 19-500, a system that, in a relatively cool and bureaucratic way, ensured that prisoners' basic living standards were maintained during captivity, even if those standards were far from luxurious. She gradually realized that in this camp, hunger still existed, but it no longer determined a person's every action in such a naked, all-encompassing way. People complained about portion sizes, reminisced during work breaks about food from their pre-war hometowns, and shared Red Cross parcels among several bunks. Occasionally someone tried to claim extra rations or hide food, but in most cases such behavior was dissuaded by fellow prisoners, not from any lofty motive, but because they did not want the camp to slide back into a state where everyone had to live by rummaging in garbage. Red Cross parcels, the relatively ample wartime agricultural output in the United States, and the demand for POW labor combined to create a delicate balance in the camp. The prisoners were both controlled subjects and laborers who had to be kept in a usable condition, so their rations were maintained at a level that was enough to live on, with a small margin beyond that. For Hanna, the incident with the loaf of bread became the point from which she began to understand this balance. She started to recall her posture on those nights when she had searched refuse heaps on the Eastern Front and realized that this posture had actually stripped away many of the habits associated with being a person. She no longer cared whether her clothes were clean, no longer cared how others looked at her, and no longer cared whether she was using methods that should have been reserved for animals in order to get food. Now, when a guard by the garbage can used a simple act to remind her, "You do not need to do this anymore," he was not merely giving her calories. He was redrawing the boundary between her and her past. The war did not stop because of such subtle psychological changes. The world outside was still collapsing. German cities were being destroyed piece by bombing, and millions of civilians went hungry and froze on the roads as they fled. From time to time, the camp's loudspeakers broadcast news from the front, and the red and blue lines on the map boards were completely redrawn within a matter of weeks. When news of capitulation and ceasefire reached the camp, the prisoners fell into a brief, indescribable silence. They sighed with relief at the end of the war, yet were uneasy at the thought of returning to a country that had nothing left and where even the label of defeated would itself be a burden. In the first year or two after the war, many German prisoners held in POW camps in the United States and abroad were repatriated in stages. Hanna, too, boarded a ship home on a drizzly morning. The vessel was not as crowded as the one that had brought her there. From the deck she could see the grey waves and seabirds occasionally sweeping past. Before departure, the Americans gave each prisoner a simple ration pack containing a few slices of bread, a small piece of cheese, and some sweets. Looking at that packet, she suddenly realized that it had been a long time since she had deliberately looked for garbage cans. She still treasured every bite of food, but the constant tension, the readiness to pounce on scraps at any moment, had loosened a little without her noticing. When she returned to Germany, it was just around the time of the most difficult post-war hunger winter. Factories lay in ruins, railways and bridges would take years to fully repair. Displaced refugees crowded into cities that already lacked supplies, and the numbers on official ration coupons were cut again and again. Black markets quietly sprung up on street corners and in alleyways, with cigarettes and soap serving as a new form of currency. Many families had no choice but to tear apart their remaining furniture and doors to burn for warmth. Against this backdrop, not rummaging in garbage seemed like a kind of luxurious insistence. Her younger siblings had grown older and often suggested going to rubbish heaps on the outskirts and to the back alleys of markets to try their luck, hoping to find rotten potatoes or vegetable leaves that had been discarded. Whenever this happened, she thought of the scene by the garbage cans behind the POW camp kitchen. It was not that she had developed a fastidious disgust for refuse since then, but that she knew once a person became accustomed to that way of living, it became very hard for them to believe they had the right to live in any other way. She did not want her brothers and sisters to accept this humiliation as a normal condition of existence from the very beginning. So she chose to face hunger by other means, volunteering for city clearing and reconstruction work to earn extra rations through labor, organizing small mutual aid kitchens with neighbors, pooling whatever food each household could spare into a large pot of soup, and then dividing it evenly according to the number of mouths, and insisting, while waiting in line at markets, that distribution follow orderly queues rather than allowing the strong to push to the front. She knew that these measures were far from enough to eliminate hunger, but at least they could preserve some order and dignity within it. Once, she saw a skinny boy at a public tap on a street corner trying to dig something out of a garbage box. In that instant, she almost saw her former self. She walked over without scolding him or adopting the attitude of playing the role of civilization that the camp guard might have been thought to represent. She simply handed him the small piece of bread she had saved for that day, and in a calm voice told him that if he truly could find nothing to eat, he could go line up at the church door on a certain street, where a bowl of thin porridge was handed out every noon. She knew that the standard of that porridge would likely fall far short of the rations she had once received in the American camp, and she understood that in a society that had only just gone through collapse, the boundary between civilization and barbarism was always on the verge of giving way. Even so, she stubbornly wanted to draw that line, even if only within the few inconspicuous meters around her. Many years later, when the German economy gradually began to recover and colorful packaged foods reappeared in shop windows, Hanna had found a stable job in a school cafeteria. Day after day, she dealt with noisy children, deliveries of potatoes and meat, and piles of dishes stacked like little hills. Sometimes she would hear students complain that the meal that day was bad, or pick at the bread because it was not soft enough. In those moments, she felt a brief, complex emotion. Part of it was a sense of relief. Only when people no longer treat every mouthful as life-saving rations do, they have the luxury of being picky. Part of it was a faint unease, a fear that they would never understand how far the distance was between a rubbish heap and that sweet loaf of bread. She never told the students about her time in the POW camp or about the refuse pits on the Eastern Front. She simply insisted that everyone should finish the food on their plates as far as possible and not casually throw away nearly untouched bread into the garbage in front of other classmates. Occasionally, when some child secretly dumped leftovers and she caught them, she would have the child stand quietly to one side and watch the kitchen staff pour barrels of leftover food into designated containers. She did not condemn waste with grandiose lectures, but explained in a calm voice how many people might be spared one missed meal if those things were distributed properly. She did not know how deep an impression such explanations would leave in a child's mind, but she understood that civilization did not arrive at a single moment. It was established bit by bit, in one small decision after another. On many nights in her life, she still dreamed of that garbage can. The details in her dreams kept changing. Sometimes the garbage can was still a dirt pit like those on the Eastern Front, surrounded by piles of frozen potato skins and rotting vegetable leaves. Sometimes it became the neat metal can by the back door of the POW camp, with a guard of indistinct features standing beside it. In either case, she always ended up pulling her gaze away from the contents of the can and turning instead to the piece of bread in her hand. That bread was both a concrete object and a symbol of a certain boundary in her heart. As long as she held on tight, she could remind herself that there had been a moment when someone, through a specific act, had told her she did not have to prove her right to exist in a heap of garbage like an animal. She did not, because of that American guard's gesture, nurture any naive illusions about the entire occupation or POW system. She knew very clearly that even within the same country and under the same institutional framework, behaviors and attitudes could differ dramatically. Some camps enforced regulations, while others, under resource strain or negligent management, gave rise to neglect and cruelty. Some people tried to preserve a trace of humanity in the face of authority. Others took pleasure in feeling superior as they watched others' humiliation. She also knew that the poverty and hunger of post-war Germany could not be washed away or offset by one loaf of bread or a single kind gesture. The bombed-out cities, the families who had lost loved ones, and those who had suffered unspeakable horrors on other fronts and in concentration camps would not be made whole again by anyone's kindness. Precisely for that reason, the loaf of bread never became, in her mind, a pretext to beautify one side or another. It remained only a reminder that amid large-scale violence and rigid systems, individuals could still make different choices at a very small scale. The clauses in American manuals, the articles of the Geneva Convention, and the reports and statistics of Allied camp inspectors formed the institutional framework and background. But on that day, by the garbage can, a guard's simple gesture made her understand that these abstract rules would only become concrete dignity or humiliation in real life through the conduct and decisions of individuals. In her view, the first layer of dignity that civilization grants a person may not lie in grand words of lofty declarations, but in what appear to be trivial bottom lines. For example, allowing someone to no longer have to prove their right to be full by rummaging in garbage. Or, in the harshest of years, still making an effort to distribute limited food according to some set of rules rather than quietly letting the strong plunder the weak. Or again, when facing a prisoner whose being has been worn down by hunger until only instinct remains, choosing to hand her a whole clean loaf of bread instead of letting her continue to repeat that humiliating motion in the garbage. Many years after the war ended, when she occasionally saw phrases like 0 hour or a new beginning in newspapers or books, what came to mind was not political speeches or diplomatic treaties, but that almost invisible line extending out from the garbage can. At one end of that line was the animal instinct to survive, at the other the minimum requirement for being human. She knew she could not always stand on the brighter side of that line, but at least once, someone had pulled her back from the other side, and through many small choices for the rest of her life, she did her best not to let herself or those around her slide so easily into the past again. For listeners, what may be easiest to remember is the shocking contrast of that moment. An Eastern Front servicewoman who had learned to survive by scavenging in rubbish heaps is stopped by a guard at the back door of an American POW camp, no longer allowed to seek food in that posture, and instead unexpectedly receives a whole, clean, sweet loaf of bread. For her, however, what was truly unforgettable was not the taste of that bread, but a belief it quietly established within her. As long as there is any possibility, no one should be forced to look for their own value in a heap of garbage. And perhaps the meaning of civilization begins right at the point where one no longer has to rummage in refuse, and then slowly extends outward from there.